Welcome back to the Get Respect series, being an assertive creative. So I'm Stephen, I'm a writer, podcaster and filmmaker with Evil Sheep Productions, where I work with my daughter and we make small creative productions together. But in my day job, I'm also a behavioural change coach, where I work with organisations and individuals to help them achieve their goals. So a very brief recap from part one. We said that as a creative, you perhaps feel that there's an unequal power differential going on. You know, as a creative, you might not have lots of experience, or you might just feel that all the cards are held by other people. And so you perhaps feel hesitant or not sure how to get what you need or want. Now, before we started, I asked you to just do a simple exercise. So if you've not done that, pause the video here. But I asked you to think about what is it that you want, both career-wise, perhaps out of life, but also in individual situations that you find yourself in. You know, what's your goal? What do you want? What do you want more of, and what do you want less of? So just jot those down. If you did that last time, that's great. Keep that handy, because we'll refer to that from time to time throughout this program. We defined assertiveness in two ways. So we said that assertiveness was a way of behaving that makes sure you get attention and respect. But we also said that it's a way of behaving that gives you the best chance of getting more of what you want and need, whilst at the same time maintaining a good working relationship with other people. And that's something you need if you're in any industry, quite frankly. We talked briefly about alternatives to assertive behaviour, the so-called natural behaviours like aggressive behaviour, passive behaviour, or perhaps a slightly more scheming passive-aggressive. We said that passive behaviour was a way of behaving that meant that your wants or your needs were ignored and you didn't get what you needed or wanted from situations. You don't make enemies, but you might struggle to get respect. Your point of view is not listened to or valued, and you don't get what you need or want from a situation. And then we talked about aggressive behaviour, and we said that that's a behaviour that is basically about trying to dominate the other person. So getting what you want through dominating the other person. And this too has consequences. One problem is that you might get attention, but you don't necessarily get respect. You might also be difficult to work with. It makes the working environment difficult, and you might end up with a bad reputation because people don't want to work with you. And then we talked about passive-aggressive behaviour, which is a kind of indirect way of dominating or trying to undermine the other person. So that could be done through sarcasm or through quietly undermining other people. Consequences of that behaviour are that people might not trust you. And again, they perhaps don't want to work with you because you make the atmosphere difficult and quite poisonous. And finally, on our review from last time, I talked about 6 things that you can do, 6 rules for assertive behaviour. And we put that into a little acronym called ADISCO. Adult to adult relationships with people. Adult to adult communication. Being direct and honest, but polite. Using I statements, I need, I would like. Being solution oriented. Calmly expressing ourselves and taking ownership of our behaviour, which means not blaming other people for what we do. So let's get cracking with part 2, which we're going to look at why we do what we do. So we're thinking about the causes of behaviour and whether there's anything we can do to change that. Because it's all very well having a nice little acronym, but when it comes down to it, it's quite difficult to do things a certain way. So is it possible, and do we want to even try? So the first question that I've just alluded to really is, should we actually try to change our behaviour? You know, is that a betrayal of ourself? And I think that's an important question to ask. So we need to, first of all, ask the question, is it possible to change, but also, should we try? So I would describe this question as a question of authenticity versus utility. So what do I mean by that? Well, authenticity is about kind of being yourself. And everybody wants to feel a sense that they can be themselves, be who they feel they are. On the other hand, Utility might be behaving in a way that gets more of what we want. So deliberately trying to behave in a certain way to get an outcome we're looking for. So it could feel that there's a kind of debate about these two. There's a tension between the two. Do we want to be authentic, or do we want to be thinking about a pragmatic way of behaving, the utility of it? So this brings up questions around idealism versus pragmatism. So we might have an idealized view of being yourself all the time, or you might have a pragmatic view, which is I'll do whatever it takes. You might describe that as an all or nothing approach, or black and white thinking. So hopefully you're starting to get the sense that I'm going to recommend that extreme on either side of this discussion, of this debate, is probably not a good idea. And I've tried to illustrate this by means of a pair of scales and thinking about balance. So on the one hand, we might think that we should essentially just be ourselves all of the time and not care about the consequences. People need to take us for who we are, and if they don't like that, well, that's tough. So that would kind of be an extreme authentic position, if you like. I'm just going to be whatever it feels like I'm going to do. I'm going to behave in a way that I want to behave, and basically whatever happens then happens. The other extreme would be to become a chameleon, essentially, and say to yourself, well, I'm just going to behave in a way that I think other people want me to. So I would suggest that down either one of those two roads lies some real potential problems. If we decide to be so authentic so as not to care about the impact we have on other people, then we're likely to find it quite difficult to get anywhere with anything. On the other hand, if we're trying to please everybody else all the time, that we forget who we are, then that too can have consequences. So obviously I've given this illustration of a pair of scales for a reason. I think the reality is, for most of us, we have a sense of authenticity, of who we are, but we might modify behaviour in certain situations at certain times, depending on what we think our goals are and what we think the best thing to do is, while still maintaining that sense of authenticity, of who we are. And I'm going to look at that in more detail in a moment. It's worth noting that long-term extreme inauthenticity, in other words, just essentially trying to be what everybody else wants you to be, can be really difficult. And that can mean you end up in jobs that you really don't want to do, or that you don't feel suit you, and you find yourself saying yes to all sorts of things that you don't really want to do. So I definitely wouldn't recommend that. But on the other hand, imagining that it's all about me and how I respond and everybody else just has to put up with that, I'm not sure that's the most useful approach either. So I'm all for balance. On this course and in all my programs, I'm a big advocate of looking to maybe adapt our behaviour, making small adjustments, because those small adjustments actually can have some really quite large consequences and can actually get us more of what we want without trying to rip apart our personality or who we are. So on this programme, I will talk about relatively small modifications of thinking and behaviour. And I would be cautious of people who claim to be able to make radical changes in your personality. I would be cautious both because it's very difficult to do, and secondly, I would be cautious because it's probably not very healthy. So let's look at some small modifications we can make, and that's going to give us some good outcomes. Okay, so as you can see from all my mini-me's there, we are behaving all over the place, all of the time. Whether you're being happy, whether you're interacting with somebody, whether you're getting angry, whether you're sad. If you choose not to interact with somebody, that's another form of behaviour. So basically, we are behaving all of the time. And in fact, we cannot not behave. And we're going to explore this by looking at 4 subheadings. The first one is where all this behaviour comes from. So we're going to explore the roots of our behaviour. What's the ingredients, or the set of ingredients that go up to make us? We're also going to look at our sense of identity, who we think we are, and then we're going to look at how we tell stories about that. So how we tell stories about who we are and the narrative we weave around that and why that's important. And finally, we're going to think about how we learn and how we can perhaps be more deliberate about the lessons we learn from our experiences. So let's start with, what's the source of our behaviour? Where does it come from? Well, essentially there's 4 elements that we're going to discuss. So firstly, we get a whole bunch of stuff for free. In other words, our instincts are there to start with. However that's been coded, we have that from the moment we're born. And of course animals have those instincts too. Here's an example of one of our most powerful instincts, which is our fear response. So when we feel threatened, when we feel afraid for whatever reason, whether that's life or death fear or maybe social fear, we have generally one of 3 responses. We either come out fighting, or we might try to remove ourselves from the situation, run away in other words, flight response, or we might freeze, not quite know what to do, and we end up like the proverbial rabbit in the headlights. So these are very natural ways of behaving. We don't think about them, we don't plan them, they just happen straight away without us even thinking about it. These are instincts, and we've got quite a few of them. Fear is one of the most powerful type of instincts, but of course we have lots of others too. Something else we get for free is our inherited traits from our parents and our other ancestors. So you may have been told, oh, you're just like your dad, or you're just like your mum, or, you know, I can see your granddad in you. And so you kind of have these traits, these tendencies to behave in a certain way. And that's because we've inherited them. So personality traits are, to some degree, heritable. So we end up inheriting some of these tendencies. Another really important element is our environment. So our environment is basically everything that's not inherited. So that could be, you know, where we were born, the culture in which we were born into, what happened to us as children, what happened to us years ago or last week or whatever. So our environment is constantly impacting upon our thinking and ultimately on our behaviour. So our behaviour comes from our environment. Our childhood has a big part to play in this, but we do have the ability to learn and develop and change pretty much all through our lives. And finally, the one that I want to focus on today is what I've called being human. So what do I mean by being human? Well, being human are those ways of thinking and ways of behaving that, whilst some animals who are very intelligent might have some of those things, we think that humans are pretty unique in the amount of this type of thinking that we do, such as reflecting upon what's happened. You know, you might have an experience and then you might think about that for a while, think about what happened. That could make you angry, or it could make you think about how to do it better next time. You might then plan, perhaps rationally think about, right, next time that happens, I'm going to do this. So you're rationally now planning the future. This gives you a feeling of self-agency, so you can sort of make decisions about what you're going to do. Now, whilst instincts are incredibly powerful and it's hard just to ignore them entirely, we can think of new tactics and new strategies to overcome some of our tendencies and things we might have done before. So these are human qualities, the ability for us to think rationally and reflect upon what we're doing, what we did, and what we should do for the future. And this relates to goal setting, because of course if we are able to set goals, then that means we can think about what's the best way to achieve those goals. So it allows us to plan our behaviour, to plan years into the future. So we can see animals doing some goal setting behaviours, perhaps when hunting and so on, but it's unlikely to imagine a dog thinking, you know, where am I going to be in 10 years time, you know. So only humans, as far as we know, have that kind of really long term goal setting and then planning to achieve things that we want. And this leaves the room open for personal development. It means that there's an opportunity for us to adapt and change, to become more appropriate, if you like, for what we want to achieve. So we're able to modify our behaviour, we're able to put things into action that we think is going to give us a better chance of getting more of what we want or need. It's time for a quiz. What are the 4 factors that make up who you are and how you behave? 4 factors that make up who you are and how you behave. Pause the video now to do the quiz. Okay, so here are the answers. We have instincts. We have inherited traits from our parents and our grandparents. We have learned behaviour from our environment. And then we have being human, actually thinking rationally about what we're going to do. So the great news about the human factor, if you like, is that it gives us opportunity for agency. It gives us opportunity to make decisions about what we're going to do and how we're going to do them. So while some of the things that go towards our behaviour, like instincts and inherited traits, we've got those and we can't really change those, we can make some decisions about how we're going to behave. So we have some room to adapt and to modify our behaviour. That's really the area that we're focusing on this programme. Okay, so let's have a look at the second subheading that we want to understand assertiveness, our mind, and where our behaviour comes from, and that's our identity. So what do we mean by identity? So I'm going to draw on a theory called SelfConcept Theory, because it's a really useful way of thinking about our identity and who we see ourselves as being. And a good way of describing this idea is that your self-concept is my theory of me. It's your theory of you. So think about it like that. So your self-concept is how you think you are, what you think you are, how you behave, what's your identity. So one way of describing it is, it's my awareness of a set of characteristics, values, and beliefs about myself. When it comes to this self-concept, there's a couple of things that I need in order for it to work. Firstly, I seek to maintain internal consistency. So all these different parts of me, how I would describe myself, I kind of look for those to be consistent. So that's one thing. Secondly, I seek to protect and maintain a feeling of self-esteem. So what do I mean by self-esteem? A feeling that I'm important, that I'm valued. The third element that's worth noting is that this self-concept gradually changes over time, or can gradually change over time. So we can gradually shift our self-concept, or at least modify it a little bit. So we'll talk about how we might do that and why we might want to. So let's just remember those two things. Self-concept theory is the idea that it's a sense of how we think about our characteristics, our values, our behaviour, and how we describe those. And self-concept theory says that we try to defend our sense of self-esteem. We want to be seen as valued, and we will defend that. And we try to promote that feeling as well. So let's have a look at an illustration. Now, I've used myself as a model because I think it's only right that I should talk about my own theory of me, because really we're talking about everybody's individual theory of us. It's not about how other people see us, it's about how we see ourselves. So I can't really develop your theory of you, only you can do that. This is my theory of me. And of course, I've not put everything on here. These are just some of the ways I think of myself. So I'm going to start with human. I see myself as a human first and foremost, I suppose. Then underneath that, I do have quite a strong sense of my male gender, if you like. So I see myself as a man. And a very salient part of my identity is that I'm a father. And then if we look underneath these, we see things like, I'd like to think of myself as caring. In fact, I do think about myself as caring. And I'm quite a serious person. I like a joke, but I am generally quite a serious person. I'm thoughtful in the respect that I think about things a lot. I'm also a psychology graduate and I'm a trainer. So you can see how all of these parts of me, if you like, sit together as a kind of hierarchy of selves. So we can think of ourselves as being a mixture of all these different selves. I'm a human, but I'm also a father, I'm also caring, and I'm also serious, and so on. Now, one of the things that's quite significant, I mentioned it already, is that we, as human beings, we like to have all of these different selves in alignment. So as you can see there, being caring sits very naturally with being a father, which sits naturally with being a man, which sits naturally with being a human. So if I have very contradictory selves, things that seem to cut across each other, then that can be quite difficult for me. It can damage a sense of well-being. So one of the things that for our well-being we kind of should try to aspire to is to make sure that our different concepts about ourselves are aligned, in harmony with each other. There's no big massive differences. Sometimes people talk about having to be a different person when they're at work, and this is one of those tropes, isn't it, on films and so on, mafia bosses or Nazis, doing terrible things during the day and then going back to their families. We see that as incongruent, as difficult to resolve. And there's good evidence that people, although they are able to do that for a period of time, it can damage them psychologically. So we look to try to have congruent, aligned different selves that seem to be pointing in the same direction. So I mentioned that we also have this need to enhance and defend our sense of self-esteem. So that means that we need to feel that we are valued, that we are worth something in the world, or at least to other people, that we have some level of importance. If we start to feel that those things are not the case, then we start to take action to try and defend our self-esteem. So why are we talking about this? Well, who we see ourselves as being, our identity, has a big part to play in how we behave, how assertive we are, and our response to change. So the takeout of this self-concept theory is that if we want to make changes to our behaviour, we're going to need to integrate those changes into our self-concept. In other words, it's going to need to be aligned with who we see ourselves as being. In other words, if we start to behave in ways that we just don't see ourselves, that's going to be difficult for us to A, do in the first place, and B, to maintain. And we're also going to want to do things that defend and enhance that self-esteem. Okay, it's time for a quiz. What is our self-concept? Your self-concept is your theory of you. My self-concept is my theory of me. It's my awareness of a set of characteristics, beliefs and values about who I am. When it comes to a theory of me, what do I seek? Two things. I seek to maintain consistency or congruence with other aspects of myself, and I seek to enhance and protect my self-esteem. Right, so let's move on now to life scripts, because that's going to have a large part to play in how we describe ourselves. In fact, that's really what we mean. But just before we do that, I wanted to make you aware of how you can get your questions answered about how to get respect, be assertive, get more of what you want and need without being a jerk. What Should I Think About is my weekly podcast where my daughter and I have the ambitious goal of trying to make sense out of this contradictory, complicated and confusing thing we call the world. And the first Monday of every month, I look at your questions about assertiveness and how you can be more assertive in everyday situations. So just reach out to me at SelfConcept on Twitter, let me have your question, and don't forget to subscribe to the What Should I Think About podcast, new episodes every Monday. So what is your life script? Your life script is a story that you tell yourself and other people about yourself. It's your own narrative, it's your own story. And of course that'll be made up of lots and lots of stories that all come together to make an overarching narrative. That's your life script. If identity is about what you think about yourself, your life script is how you talk about yourself. This story is based upon your self-concept, and it also uses examples, metaphors, other stories to kind of weave a narrative about who you are. So you're likely to tell people about a time when you did this or when you experienced that, and you sometimes go back to school to talk about this. At school I was really naughty, or I was really good at history, or I was really good at this or really good at that, or I didn't like this or I didn't like that, and that shaped the way I do things all these years later. So these stories weave themselves together to make this overarching narrative about who you are. So you might say things like, yeah, I always do X when Y happens. That's part of my nature. When somebody says this to me, I always do that. I do X because of a past experience. I've learned those bad habits, or I've learned from the best, and that's why I do what I do now. I'm not very good at X because of my personality. I'm just not very good at it, Or I'm good at X because it's just natural, it's a gift. These are all stories that you tell yourself about yourself, and you tell other people about yourself, all based around your self-concept. Just like I described myself as being a father and somebody who cares about my daughter. So one way of thinking about this script is that it's so important because it creates a feedback loop which helps you to explain what's happened to you and what's happened around you, but it also helps predict what's going to happen in the future. And the two kind of feed off each other. So your script both predicts and explains your behaviour. Here's just a pictorial example of that diagram that I've just shown you. So we might say to ourselves before we go into a situation, I don't think I'm going to get what I want because I find it really difficult to ask for things, to say what it is I want or need. It's just that's the way I am, I've never been able to stand up for myself. So I don't think I'm going to get what I want out of this meeting or this situation. And then after the meeting, you might say, yeah, I didn't really get what I wanted out of that situation because I've never been very good at that sort of thing. I've never been very good at getting what I need or want. So in a way, these are mirror images of the same person, the same narrative. They're just temporally different. One reflects what's going to happen and the other then explains it. We might call it a self-fulfilling prophecy. So let's have a look at a couple of examples of this. You see, I take after my nan. My mouth always gets me into trouble. So that is a narrative sometimes I hear people say. There's some relative, could be their parents or could be their grandparents or even could be an uncle or something. Oh yeah, I'm just like my Uncle Joe. My mouth always gets me into trouble. Now, I'm going to be quite hard on that way of thinking because I would say that means that we are trapped by our genes. We're kind of giving ourselves an out to say that actually, even though this behaviour might not be what I want and what is going to get me the best outcome, I've got no control, I've got no agency about that because of what my nan did. So I'm kind of blaming my nan. I'm like this because of what happened in the past. Now, I do just want to say here that I'm not talking about serious things about which you've got some trauma. If you have those sorts of situations, then my advice is always to seek professional help. But here I'm just talking about everyday decisions that we might make, and we put it down to a terrible boss we had 10 years ago, or the first boss I ever had, or whatever. And we sort of explain our behaviour based around our past. And in a way, we could describe that as being trapped by it, trapped by our past. The question is, can we tell a different story? Is it possible to create new stories about ourselves? Let's try and answer that question with an example. So here's the example. You see, I'm just too nice. I just find it too difficult to say what I need or want. So that's a story, that's a script. I'm just too nice. I just find it too difficult to say what I need or want. So could you replace that? What about, I like to be nice, So I'm always polite when I say what I need or want. So can you notice the subtle difference there? The first one, I'm just too nice. I just find it too difficult to say what I need or want. So that closes us into this idea that we just simply can't get past our genes. The second example is saying that because of my being nice, I always ask for what I want or need in a polite way. So there's an assumption there that I can and I do ask for what I want, but there's an acknowledgement of who I am. So why am I suggesting that? Why am I suggesting I like to be nice, so I'm always polite when I say what I need or want, as opposed to perhaps, if I have to upset people to get what I want, that's their problem. I don't care. I've learned to be assertive. Don't forget, we try to keep our various selves aligned, pulling in the same direction, and congruent with each other. They're also very strong. This sense of who we are is very, very strong. So your story has to be congruent. If it's not, you're unlikely to make the change. And even if you do, it's more difficult to sustain it. Don't forget, I've already mentioned the fact that on this course, I recommend small changes, modifications that can have big outcomes. And be cautious of claims that you can radically change your personality. Don't forget, small changes can have big effects when it comes to the outcomes you're looking for. So the nub of this is, if being nice is an important part of your hierarchy of selves, this way that you see yourself, if being nice is part of that, then trying to unnice yourself is going to be very difficult, if not impossible. And I would suggest unnecessary. So you're not going to try and unnice yourself, but what you're going to do is incorporate your ability to ask for what you want while still allowing that to happen within the concept of nice. Therefore, I'm okay with asking what I want and need, but I do it in a nice way because I'm a nice person, as opposed to I'm suddenly going to become a completely different person and I'm going to, kick ass from now on. If that's not you, if that's not your self-concept, if that's not the way that you see yourself, and everything else would have to change to integrate that new way of thinking about yourself, it's going to be very unlikely to happen or stick. And it's also going to be quite uncomfortable for you to do. So, if you're going to make a change, make a small change, and one that can integrate into your concept of who you are, which means you can tell a story that makes sense. You may have watched a television programme or a film where suddenly the character in it behaves completely out of character. You just got to know them, and all of a sudden they do something that just seems so far out of character. It just kind of breaks your interest and your investment in that person. So that can happen with us and our stories. So make sure they are congruent and our new story fits and integrates into our self-concept. So for our example here, my advice would be, if you happen to be somebody that sees themselves as nice, whatever that means to you, then find a way to incorporate that niceness into the behaviour that you're looking for. Now, of course, you might not see yourself as nice. You might see yourself as a go-getter or just somebody that doesn't really care what other people think. Okay, that's fine. Then if you're trying to modify your behaviour, you need to incorporate it into that concept. So the modifications are always working in line with who you see yourself as being. So I'm just too nice. I just find it too difficult to say what I need or want. Changing to I like to be nice. So I'm always polite when I say what I need or want has a much greater chance of success for you. Now we can also think about this story or these stories as forming an overarching narrative. And some examples are here. So we're talking about, our genetic makeup, what we've inherited from our parents, plus our instincts, our experiences. So let's incorporate all that together into an overarching narrative. You know, I have these genes and I have this history and I can't change that. Some of this is really useful to me, but some isn't so much. As a human, I have some personal agency to make choices, and I'm going to do that. So there's a narrative that you could weave together to think about how you might want to modify some of the responses, some of the ways that you might be behaving currently, how to get more of what you want in the future. A way of being human could be, I know my goals, I know what I want to achieve, and I think about the best way to behave in order to get those things. Okay, time for a quiz. What is a life script? A life script is a story you tell yourself and other people about yourself. Why is our script important to how we behave? So your script creates a feedback loop which helps you both predict and explain your behaviour. Okay, we're on to our last subheading there, which is about learning. How do we learn? So conditioned behaviour is the first thing we're going to talk about. And I'm just going to briefly talk a little bit about the history of learning and how we understand learning. It's gone through quite a journey actually in psychology. So if we go back to the sort of mid-20th century, we had this movement called behaviourism, and psychologists were doing lots of experiments into how animals learned and then applying that to how humans might learn. And a good example of this was the so-called Skinner box. Skinner was one of the leading psychologists who developed behaviourism. What he found was that you could train pigeons or rats or animals like that to do all sorts of really quite complex behaviours, movements and so on in order to get a treat, in order to get food. And so he taught pigeons to, peck on something a few times and then turn in a circle and then peck again and so on. And they started to learn these processes. But this was all through just really seeing, from the animal's perspective, it was just called conditioned behaviour. So they weren't sort of planning it out, thinking, well, if I do this and then I do that, then I'm going to get the result I want. It was purely environmental. So something had happened, they'd noticed that, and then they got their treat. So they did it again. So it was just as simple as that. And sometimes quite complex behaviours could be developed that way. So if you've just looked at your phone, then that's a good example of conditioned behaviour. So you become so used to that ping, meaning you've got a message, that you straight away look at your phone. So much of our behaviour is learned unconsciously. We're not planning it out, just like that pigeon wasn't thinking about, if I try this and I try that, am I going to get the result I'm looking for? It learned through trial and error, and then it picked up on the results, and it ended up learning through that conditioned response. So as soon as it saw that situation, it knew what to do. So much of our behaviour, more than we probably think, is learned through conditioned responses. We just get used to one thing leading to another and we behave accordingly. Okay, so because this conditioning is part of our unconscious thinking process, in other words, we're not consciously aware of it, this is not our planned behaviour, this happens very quickly, and it operates in a way that is much quicker than our conscious thinking can keep up with. So we often find ourselves behaving in a way that we maybe later decided against. Now, this is a great book if you're interested in psychology and really everyday thinking. It's called Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow by Daniel Kahneman, and it's a very good read. There's some complicated bits, but it's quite well written. Definitely recommend it. And here he talks about System 1 and System 2 thinking. So System 1 thinking is this very fast, often instinctive, but can be learned through the sorts of things I've described, through conditioning. And that's one type of thinking. System 2 thinking is that more deliberate, that human way of thinking that allows us to reflect on what's happened and rationally consider future actions. So in a way, what we're trying to do here, if we want to change our behaviour, we're trying to interrupt the unconscious and just to slow our thinking down a little bit so that it leaves room for our conscious system 2 type of thinking to engage that rational, that reflective part of our mind. So by being more thoughtful, we can block system 1 type responses from just making us do things without thinking. And we can decide to promote more useful behaviours. Did you do it again? Did you look at your phone again? Very strong, these unconscious behaviours. So one of the ways that we can start to initiate our system 2 thinking, this more thoughtful, reflecting, rational type of thinking, is to mindfully and thoughtfully think about our experiences. So I've got a little example of a learning model here. So we think about it as being just, this is very simple, this is how human beings learn essentially. We take action, we then notice what happened, we then adjust, and we take action again, and we notice again. And that actually lends itself to the sorts of behaviour that we talked about at the beginning of this section, like rats and pigeons and dogs and other animals learn just by association or just by conditioning. They do something, something happens, they adjust their behaviour, they take action and so on. So this is a very kind of natural way of learning. What I would suggest is that we try and slow that process down a bit by reflecting on what's happened. So just giving ourselves some time to think about what happened. So it's not just noticing, but engaging our rational thinking processes, our reflective thinking processes, to think about what just happened. We can then not just react, but think through and plan what we want to do for the next time. So we have thought through and planned behaviour. And I would also suggest that generally we make small changes in our behaviour, in what we're saying or how we say it, to help us to both, it's easier to do that, but also it means we can see what changes are making the difference. So the focus, what's my focus? If I'm doing that analysis of something that's just happened, what's my focus? Well, my focus is to think about what happened, think about what worked, think about what didn't. And also think about what can I change? What can I learn from that audition? What worked in that project? What didn't work so well? What can I change about that application for funding? So we're always thinking about what we've just done and how we can improve. You'll never know everything about what happened, but you might be able to find out some more stuff, some more data about what happened. So when you're analysing your behaviour or something that you've just done, you can think about, what do I know, what don't I know, how could I get more information? And then you can learn from that and start to think about how could I do it differently. But don't forget, you can never know everything. So your conclusions are always going to be tentative. So if you applied for some funding or if you went for an interview and you didn't get it, you could get some more information possibly. You could ask, could you give me some feedback about the interview? Could you give me some feedback about the application? What was it that made you think not at this time or whatever? So you're really trying to find out exactly what happened and you're reflecting upon what you did. But there will be times when you simply don't know what happened or you can't have full information. So you're always working on partial information. So another way of thinking about this decision making, reflecting upon our behaviour the human way, we can think about, well, something happened. I did a gig, I went for an interview, I did a presentation, I put in an application for funding, I tried to set up a meeting, whatever it is, something happened. So the first question you might ask is, in order for me to understand what happened, do I have enough information? If the answer to that is no, what you want to do is try to get more information. So like I said, that could be contacting the organisation that you did the application for. It could be asking for feedback from the person that interviewed you. Lots and lots of different options there. So you might think, well, how could I get more data? How could I understand more about the decisions that were made and why they were made? And then what you learn about that feeds back in to your analysis of what happened. If the answer to that question is yes, I do have the information, or I've got enough information, then you are reflecting, you're analysing what happened. You're thinking about what happened, you're thinking about what you did well, you're thinking about what you could change for next time, you're thinking about any mistakes you made and how you could improve or do something different the next time you have that same or a similar situation. You can then plan for that. So, okay, I'm going to do this the next time, or maybe you've got another interview coming up, you're going to plan how to change what you did in that situation. And then you act accordingly. Of course, that action, once executed, becomes the fact that something has happened. So you can see, again, this is a learning loop. In fact, these two illustrations are really the same thing, just in a bit more detail. Or the one on the left has got more detail in it. But really, it's about learning from our experiences, thinking through what happened, considering what the improvement could be in what we're doing and how we might do it. A few things to remember. Don't forget that the idea here is not to be perfect every time. You know, it's not to beat ourselves up. It's not to look for reasons to castigate ourselves or think we're no good. It is purely to learn and think about how we might improve the next time. It's to raise our consciousness. It's to increase that system 2 thinking, allowing us to think through what happened and how we might improve next time. It's about responding more like a human and less from our instincts. It's definitely not about beating ourselves up. It's about learning and gradually finding the most useful actions to take, which could include behaviours, how we interacted with those individuals. The great news about this is that just like those other less conscious ways of behaving, eventually these new ways of behaving, the new approaches that we might make, the new way we might ask for something, or the new way we might say what it is we wanted or needed, or the new way we might behave like an adult as opposed to a child, or stay an adult rather than go to parent, or use I statements. The good news is those things can become habits, just like the unconscious behaviours. In fact, they become unconscious behaviours. So we then have adopted these new ways of doing business, of behaving. But it does take time. So at this point, I want to hark back to a disco, because that's at the heart of how we can learn. This is the framework around which we can place events and things that have happened. We can think about, were we talking to the person as an adult? Did they drive us down to child? Or did they make us behave like a parent? How could we maintain our adult ego state next time? Was I direct? Was I clear about what I wanted to put over to the person? Was I clear about what I needed? Was I clear about the conditions that I was looking for? Did I use I statements? I would like, I need. Was I solution oriented? So rather than presenting problems, did I come up with the ways forward, possible ways of solving those issues? Did I maintain my calm? And am I willing to take ownership of my behaviour? So this ongoing work on a disco can help make new ways of doing things more of a habit. And then we end up telling a new story about ourselves to reinforce and predict this behaviour. Okay, time for our final quiz. How does your life script affect your behaviour? Your life script creates a feedback loop with your experiences, and both helps to explain your behaviour and reinforces it for the next time. Okay, now this one, I'd like to just jot down the labels. So what goes into those boxes? Right, we're nearly at the end of part 2. So to summarise, we have various different causes of behaviour. We have instincts like our fight and flight responses. We have inherited traits like things we got from our parents or our grandparents. We're also shaped by our environment and the way we learn from our environment, but we can take that learning and do something good with it by using our human qualities of being able to reflect on what happened, analyse what happened, think about better, new ways of handling those situations and continually develop and improve. Our self-concept is your theory of you, my theory of me. It's the way that I think about myself and describe myself to myself and others. And we try to keep our various selves aligned, all pulling in the same direction and congruent with one another. What's your script? Can we tell a different story? By telling a new story, but one that still aligns with our self-concept, we can find new and even more useful ways of behaving to get more of what we want. And by raising our consciousness, we can be more intentional and more mindful about our behaviour by thinking about what happened, do we need more information, really understand, analyse what happened, plan, act, and then look again. Thank you very much for watching part 2 of Get Respect. Being an assertive creative, this course was all about understanding why we do what we do and how we might be able to modify some of those behaviours. The next part, we're going to look at one specific area, which is saying no. So the next one's going to be much more focused on just that one area of how to say no. Okay, so thank you very much for watching. Don't forget to reach out on Twitter and let me know how you're getting on with the course. And don't forget, send me your questions about assertiveness on Twitter @SteveOrSheep and subscribe to the What Should I Think About podcast. New episodes drop every Monday.